Need screen sharing as well. Yeah.
Screen share.
So good morning,
Oh,
everyone, and welcome to our third and final session. The time went by quickly this weekend. We have 2 more hours we can still spend together and continue to work with this topic of grief and loss. So what I'd like to do for today to get things started is to just do another short meditation. This one is going to be a guided meditation that incorporates a little bit of Jack Kornfield's meditation on grief at the beginning, but then we work with the self-compassion meditation of Kristen Neff. You may have heard of Kristen Neff. She's a researcher into self-compassion, which is a big topic these days, and something that we're going to touch on a bit today as well. And so I thought it'd be good to do what she calls a self-compassion break, and then we'll use that to kind of set our motivation for our time together today. So as before, we're going to just spend the first few minutes in silent meditation, just working with the breath. So find a comfortable posture. Again, it doesn't have to be anything that precise. It's just a way of sitting somewhat upright and alert, but also relaxing into this posture. And then just breathing naturally, begin to pay attention to the breath, bringing your awareness to the breath in whatever way or manner that you choose. Again, I've pointed out points such as at the tip of the nostrils where you feel the air coming in and out as you inhale and exhale, or the rising and falling of the abdomen, the same when we breathe in and breathe out. Other ways to work with the breath, you can count the breaths. You can just simply be aware of the entire sensation of the breath coming in, filling the body, emptying out as we exhale. Whatever way you choose to work with the breath, just stay with that particular technique for the next few minutes and allow the mind to settle, to be somewhat focused and attentive. If you see that the mind wanders away, then when we notice that, there's no judgment. We just simply let go of whatever distracted us and gently guide our awareness back to the breath. So I'll ring the bowl to begin the meditation, and then I'll come in just a few minutes and lead you in this reflection. I might mention before we get started, just as a caution, my computer fan has been sometimes getting a little loud. So if it does that, I'll certainly try to turn it off in between what I'm saying so that my microphone isn't picking up the fan noise. But if you do hear that, I hope it isn't too distracting. But anyway, just do the best working with the breath over these next few minutes, and then I'll lead you in a short meditation. So in this opening meditation, we are going to work with grief. And as I've discussed in the earlier sessions, and we have everything from these micro griefs, these moments of feeling some sense of loss, various aspects of our life, all the way to the deeper forms of grief when we lose a loved one. But choose something to work with that is anywhere in this range, but is comfortable for you to work with. We just simply want to bring to mind that feeling of grief at the loss that we've had in our lives. So take a moment right now to identify something you're comfortable working with in this meditation. I'll give you a little time to do that. Some grief you're feeling at this moment that you can bring to mind. I might also add, keep in mind we can work with anticipatory grief, the grief we might be thinking about in regard to future losses, the loss of a loved one, a pet. Again, so work with any of these, choose one, and then I'll guide you in working with that. So as you think about this feeling of grief at the loss or pain that you are having, let the story, the images, the feelings come naturally and simply hold them gently. But just allow the entire picture, the whole story, to come to mind, all the feelings, layer by layer, just taking your time over the next minute or so to allow that to fully form within your mind. Keep breathing softly, compassionately. Let whatever feelings are there, pain and tears, anger and love, fear and sorrow, let them all come as they will. Touch them gently. Let them unravel out of your body and mind. Simply make space for these feelings and any images connected with them that might arise. Allow the whole story. As you continue with these feelings of grief and loss, the whole story before you, the first step is to simply recognize that this is a moment of suffering, that this is hard to experience loss and grief in our lives. And just remind yourself that this is simply our situation in this human life, to be vulnerable, to have to experience loss. But just validate that this is difficult, it's hard, it's stressful. Just simply be with your difficulty, your pain, your suffering, and validate it. Know that there's nothing wrong with it in the least. It's natural to have these feelings. And then, secondly, to recall that suffering is a part of life for ourselves as well as for others. This is the common humanity. It's not abnormal to grieve. Suffering, grieving, loss is a part of life. You might even use words towards yourself like, I'm not alone in my grief. This is a part of our shared humanity. And just feel that sense of interconnectedness, that we're all in this together at some level, all having to experience loss, all having to grieve. And then the third step is where we actually generate the compassionate thoughts towards ourselves. And to do this, we might put our hands at our heart. You can take one hand and gently place it at that heart center and begin to have loving, kind, compassionate thoughts towards yourself, such as, may I be kind to myself in this moment. I care about myself and my own feelings. I care about my healing. Whatever it is that you need to kind of say to yourself to extend this compassionate thought, this wish that you be free of your own suffering, that you find peace and solace. And then we take these thoughts of loving kindness and compassion and we extend them to others as well. And we hold that motivation of being here today, as we've done before, to work on ourselves, to learn from our own grief, to be able to use whatever we experience as part of our path to develop ourselves to the greatest degree so we can help others to do the same. and think that it's for this reason that we've gathered here together today with that most far-reaching motivation, the welfare of all, the freedom from suffering for all, the true happiness and peace for all. So my computer was doing very well, but perhaps you heard the fan come in at the end there. It just started yesterday afternoon, so I'm gonna have to take my computer in, I think, this week just to have the fan checked out and what have you. So I hope it doesn't become too distracting. While I'm talking, it probably isn't so bad because I'm maybe drowning out the sound of the fan. But so again, what we were doing over the last session was really working with exploring the necessity of grief and the causes of grief, beginning to understand it from a Buddhist perspective, the elements that are involved. And again, we spoke a bit about love and attachment and the need to differentiate these two, that a lot of our pain comes from our attachment, obviously, but love, of course, also because of the love we have for others. When we lose them in our lives, this can be a great source of pain. But if we have that understanding and that perspective of holding them most dear, of really thinking of them and really generating some other-centered focus to our lives, then we will have perhaps the space for our grief to have some meaning and purpose. So we then went on, and I wanted to review very briefly the process of grieving in terms of the stages of grieving that are similar to the stages of working with death, with one's own death, that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross discerned from her investigation, her observation of people who were going through that process of coming to accept their own mortality, having been given a particular prognosis or what have you. So when we apply these to grieving, it's a little bit different. So let me go through those, the ones that I did yesterday, just to kind of get us back into that topic. The first one is denial, and this is often where it starts. And for grieving, it's not quite the same as I said yesterday. It's maybe a little more symbolic than it is literal, because we can't deny if we've seen the deceased body of our loved one, or if we've experienced a particular form of loss, we can't deny that that has happened, but we might have a sense of disbelief. We might think, it's almost like it's not real, or it's like a dream. And we have to sort of process through that, because this is, once more, all of these are a sort of defense mechanism that we have, because the pain of grief and loss is very difficult for us to manage, in particular when we're dealing with the loss of someone very dear to us. So denial is our first defense mechanism, is to say, no, this can't be real, this can't be happening. We want to believe that somehow our loved one is still there, or what have you. Then anger often arises. And again, keep in mind that, as I said yesterday, it's not a linear process. These things might cycle around, and we might think we've processed our anger at what's occurred, but we might have anger arising on the basis of other things that happen in our lives that trigger that. But there are many dimensions of our anger, as we spoke about yesterday. Anger at the causes of that happening, anger at our sort of sense of unfairness, injustice, at our being the ones that have to experience this. And that might trigger anger even at others who aren't experiencing it, who seem to be immune to that sense of loss and grief. And then might even have anger at ourselves. Oftentimes we might feel like we should have done something more. We could have been there to change things, to do something different. And that, of course, becomes a guilt. It's interesting, in Tibetan Buddhism, at least to my knowledge, there is no word in Tibetan for guilt. We've created this concept in the West. I suppose that they have, similar ideas of being angry at oneself or what have you. In Buddhism, we certainly want to take responsibility for what we've done, and to say, oh, I have done something that was perhaps harmful or wasn't the most beneficial thing. But that doesn't make us a bad person. That's what guilt always tacks on to that thought. Taking responsibility for our actions, and kind of admitting that we aren't most skillful all the time, that's perfectly fine. But we're all works in progress. We don't need to beat ourselves up. We don't need to feel bad about what we've done and put ourselves through that ringer of guilt. So just know that guilt is a form of anger, if you will, kind of directed at ourselves. The third that we went through yesterday, and that's where we were stopped. We stopped at the end of our session yesterday, is the bargaining. And what's more, bargaining is a little more symbolic too, because obviously, we can't necessarily change things, can't have some kind of the way to get in there and have the outcome be different than what it was. Things have happened. We've had that loss. But nonetheless, we still have this mind that goes, what if, what if I'd done this? What if that had happened? Or if only I had done this, if only that had occurred. And that type of thinking, again, kind of gets us into a bit of a ruminating circle. We don't really move out of it, but it does keep us from fully accepting what has happened, accepting the loss, and then of course accepting the grief that comes with that loss. So it provides, again, some sort of structure as a defense mechanism as well to allow us to manage what's going on, because the chaos of grief is really quite difficult. So again, that's the role that bargaining plays. And again, any one of these might pop up at various times, and they might be stronger at times. Some people might have more anger, for example, than some of the other stages of processing grief. So that's where we stopped yesterday, was with those first three, and then we're going to go on today to depression and acceptance. But I did want to check in and see if there were any questions or comments from yesterday that people didn't get a chance to say before we continue. So does anyone have anything they'd like to share? Okay, well then let's carry on. So the fourth of these is depression, sadness. Of course, we talked about this a little bit on Friday night in response to Vanessa's comment. And I think that, again, we have to really accept that that is a part of the grieving process. Of course, that is perhaps the most profound emotion that we have connected with our grief, is the sadness, the depression of having lost someone in our lives or having lost a particular situation that we had. I'm going to read a little bit from On Grief and Grieving, the book that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler wrote together, because I think it's important, especially to validate some of what was brought up on Friday night in answering Vanessa's question. On page 20, it says, after bargaining, our attention moves squarely into the present. Empty feelings present themselves, and grief enters our lives on a deeper level, deeper than we ever imagined. This depressive stage feels as though it will last forever. It's important to understand that this depression is not a sign of mental illness. It is the appropriate response to a great loss. We withdraw from life, left in a fog of intense sadness, wondering perhaps if there is any point in going on alone. Why go on at all? Morning comes, but you don't care. A voice in your head says it is time to get out of bed, but you have no desire to do so. You may not even have a reason. Life feels pointless. To get out of bed may as well be climbing a mountain. You feel heavy, and being upright takes something from you that you just don't have to give. She they go on to explain many other the dimensions of that sort of depression that we can feel. That's a part of our grieving process. But one thing I want to share that's a little bit later in this is, it says here, when we are grieving, people may wonder about us and we may wonder about ourselves. The heavy, dark feelings of depression that come with grief, however normal, are often seen in our society as something to be treated. Of course, clinical depression, untreated, can lead to a worsening of one's mental state. But in grief, depression is a way for nature to keep us protected by shutting down the nervous system so that we can adapt to something we feel we cannot handle. So this is kind of where, again, we have to see all of these stages up to acceptance as really defense mechanisms, as what we need to do mentally and physically in order to protect ourselves. So when we are feeling that sort of sense of depression, sadness that follows a loss, it is important that we tend to that and actually once more see that we have to go through that. Of course, if we see that things are getting perhaps a little too intense, then maybe that's where it's good to seek out some professional advice. There are many grief counselors in almost every community. I think there must be at least one person who practices working specifically with grief. But those may be very useful, as well as grief support groups, to be with others who are going through that process in a similar manner to yourself. Again, not identical, but they can also be a sense of support. I might read briefly just to kind of validate this within a Buddhist context. Again, the whole purpose of this weekend was to look at this Buddhist perspective. This is from The Art of Happiness, a wonderful book by Howard Cutler wrote most of it on the basis of a time he spent with the Dalai Lama. So this is actually the Dalai Lama speaking here. He says on page 146, initially, of course, feelings of grief and anxiety are a natural human response to a loss. But if you allow these feelings of loss and worry to persist, there's a danger. If these feelings are left unchecked, they can lead to a kind of self absorption, a situation where the focus becomes your own self. And when that happens, you become overwhelmed by the sense of loss, and you get a feeling that it's only you who is going through this. Depression sets in. But in reality, there are others who will be going through the same kind of experience. So if you find yourself worrying too much, it may help to think of the other people who have similar or perhaps even worse tragedies. Once you realize that, then you no longer feel isolated, as if you have been single pointedly picked out. And that can offer you some kind of condolence. So again, he's saying that it is natural for us to have these feelings, and Buddhism would agree. I mean, these are a response to loss that we have to honor and respect for part of the process. But as he said, if it gets a little too far into a sort of insular feeling where it sort of collapses in on ourselves and we feel like it's all about us and our grief and our sadness and our depression is all that there is, well, then we have to see that that can actually become a bridge to connecting to the suffering of others. That's why I have to speak again to my own experience going through the loss of Ed 30 years ago, that relying upon a grief support group was really, really important. I think it only met for like 8 weeks, which was kind of a shame because once more, you can't put a time limit on your process of grieving. It's not over after 8 weeks and you no longer need support at that point. Rather, it's an initial way to begin to work with others who are going through a similar process. And if you are able to find that, there are available, many groups online these days, even, where you can just join a group from a distance. You don't have to even go anywhere out of your home. And that may be a more comforting way to do that, to be able to be with others who are in that same process as you. But these are the tools that we need to use. I also mentioned on Friday night, and I might reiterate that it's also important for us to think about, in particular when we've lost loved ones, what it is that they would want for us. It's not to make us feel guilty that we're grieving and feeling sad and depressed. It's just to understand that they want us to continue the process. They want us to get to the other side. I mean, without a doubt, if we look at ourselves, if we were to lose our own lives and our loved ones who are in our lives right now, we wouldn't want them to get stuck in their grief. We wouldn't want them to, be absorbed in their depression and to become a being who no longer was able to participate in life fully. Instead, we want them to continue living life, to be able to open to new possibilities and so on. So if we look at it from that perspective, if we would want that for our loved ones that we'd be leaving behind, well, then I'm sure our loved ones who have left us would want the same for us. So again, it's just a way of having that understanding, reinforcing the idea that we have to continue the process, continue to work with it, but also take care of ourselves in the midst of that. In the meditation that we did at the beginning of today of a self-compassion break is really a nice way to do that. You can do that at any time when you feel a wave of sadness, a wave of grief coming over you at whatever's going on in your life that you're grieving a loss of a job or the loss of a pet or whatever. I mean, many things affect us at very deep levels, some things at less deep levels. But would just sit quietly with yourself and acknowledge the suffering that is. That's the first step, to simply validate it, to say this is something I can completely honor as my own experience of suffering. Then secondly, to see that this is a part and parcel of our human condition, that all beings are suffering in a variety of ways, none identical again to exactly what you're experiencing, but in a similar fashion. That kind of gives us a wider scope for what we're looking at so that we don't become kind of in this very tight world of only ourselves. And then lastly, we want to kind of extend compassion to ourselves with those sorts of thoughts. I actually can make available, this is a meditation I got from Kristen Neff's website. I think it's selfcompassion.org. There might be a hyphen in there somewhere, but essentially she has many resources at her website that work with the idea of self-compassion. During the process of grieving, it's important to have that compassion for ourselves. And compassion for ourselves doesn't mean that we have to fix it, right? It means that we can simply be present with it and honor it and wish ourselves the healing that we will find on the other side of this process. And that is what we're seeking ultimately. Again, not to completely remove our grief, because grief will stay with us to in some manner as we go forward in our lives, but to rather be able to go through the process to get to the other side. And from that other side, have again a more a full engagement in life, a full engagement in our own sense of purpose and meaning and what have you. So that's a little bit about depression and that phase. I think there was one other quote that I wanted to read from this, though, I think, because this was actually a really interesting part of the book in terms of working with the stage of depression. This is on page 23 of the book. It says the stages of loss, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance have been widely used and misused. Our society almost seems to be involved in a stamp out depression campaign. Sometimes intervention is vital, but most of the time we do not allow the normal depression that comes with grief to have its place. So just re-emphasizing that idea is that when you are feeling sad and depressed at a loss, whether again it's something you're experiencing now or in the future, that doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you, that you have some mental illness or something. This is a natural part of our process. This is why, again, we might find it really difficult to get the support from others in our lives who aren't ready to be with that sadness and that depression, who always want to fix it. Now, as I said yesterday, we can understand their desire to do that from the point of view of their compassion for us. They don't want to see us suffer. When we're feeling depressed and sad, that's hard for others to be with because they would like us to be happy. They want us to be on the other side of all of this, to be back to some measure of what we might call normalcy, but I don't want to be too attached to that word. Because again, we're going to be changed on the other side of this. It is an irrevocable moment that occurs when we do lose someone in our lives, in particular, someone who's very close, that it's never the same on the other side. But we will get to a place eventually where we do have a bit more light, a bit more joy in our lives again, where food tastes good again, and where we can go to the movies and have a good time and what have you. But for now, that's not where we're at. And so it's good to choose who you are with during these times. As I said, try to be with people who are perhaps going through something similar or who have been through it, who can understand where you're at, who can say, yes, I just am going to be present with you in your sadness and not try to fix it, not try to give you suggestions about what you should do. Oh, you should go to the beach. Oh, you should go do this. And those are, again, coming from a place of their wish for us to be happy. But that's not what we need at that point. What we need is to be validated in our suffering, in our pain, in our anguish. So again, maybe that's enough to share on that. Let's go on to the final stage of acceptance. I'll talk a little bit about that, and then maybe we'll have some time for questions. By the way, I realized that yesterday I talked about introducing this regulation exercise. Maybe we'll do that now even, because we just talked about a pretty heavy subject of depression and sadness. Some of you weren't present on Friday night when I went through that. But essentially this is a form of kind of working with our breathing and our body to be able to sort of restore our balance, to regulate ourselves. So to do this, what we do again is we place our right hand over our heart center, again, right there in the center of our chest at the level of our heart. Your left hand you can place on your abdomen and just, wherever you feel that it's comfortable. And again, don't necessarily put a lot of pressure on there, but begin to pay attention to the pressure that you feel, where the hands are touching the body. You can even close your eyes for this if you wish. Just really tune into the weight of the hands on your body right now. And you may or may not feel warmth under your hands. That's not the point. Just pay attention to that sense of pressure, the weight that you feel there. And just breathe naturally, breathing in and out. And as you continue to pay attention to the pressure of the hands on the body, at some point there will be a shift in the breath. And just kind of watch for that. I'll give you a minute or so to just simply be present with this and pay attention to the breath. And when that shift happens, then at that point you are regulated. And you can just abide in this feeling of having kind of things back in balance to some degree. And then you can let go of this exercise, drop the hands, and we'll continue. So again, this technique isn't to stop you from feeling what you're feeling. It's just to acknowledge that there might be times where the emotions get a little too difficult, a little too rough. It's kind of like you're on the choppy part of the water. And so you want to maybe go to a little bit smoother surface just for the time being. Again, these feelings are important to go through and to experience, but there may be times where we feel like we need to regulate. So again, if you do find that that's the case in any of what we discuss as we go through today, it may not be the case, but that's okay. You have this exercise to work with in the future if you'd like. So let's go on to acceptance. And acceptance is the fifth stage, and it was determined to be the final stage when the initial work was done by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in working with those who are dying, of course, because that's where you want to ideally get people to, is accepting their mortality, accepting that this will be the conclusion of their life so they can perhaps again resolve whatever issues might be there so they can die peacefully, but not to be holding on to that resistance to their own situation. With grieving, again, David Kessler wrote this entire book that I've cited here and there called Finding Meaning, the sixth stage of grief, because he does feel like there's another dimension that goes beyond mere acceptance. But what do we mean by acceptance? I think this is important that we have, again, some understanding of what this means, because it doesn't mean, again, that we're okay with it. Oh, that was perfectly fine that this person died, perfectly fine that we didn't get that job or what have you. So he says here, this is again back on Grief and Grieving, Dr. Kubler-Ross and David Kessler, he says, acceptance is often confused with the notion of being all right or okay with what has happened. This is not the case. Most people don't ever feel okay or all right about the loss of a loved one. This stage is about accepting the reality that our loved one is physically gone and recognizing that this new reality is the permanent reality, is the lasting reality that we do have to adjust to. We will never like this reality or make it okay, but eventually we accept it. We learn to live with it. It is the new norm with which we must learn to live. This is where our final healing and adjustment can take a firm hold, despite the fact that healing often looks and feels like an unattainable state. So again, this is the idea, is we do have to eventually get to a place where some of that resistance is gone. Some of the other stages, perhaps of the anger and the bargaining, the denial, all of that. The depression may not completely go away, the sadness. We might still have feelings of sadness because we aren't okay with what has transpired completely, but we've come to accept it. We know that now this is our reality. We have been changed by that loss, particularly again, if it's a profound loss in our lives, but we're not going to keep going to a place of wishing that it was something other than that. We will accept it for what it is. And we can see how this is almost a natural bridge into that last step that David Kessler identified of finding meaning. But before we go on to that, I want to share one little paragraph that also comes from On Grief and Grieving. It says, as we heal, we learn who we are and who our loved one was in life. In a strange way, we move through grief. As we move through grief, healing brings us closer to the person we loved. A new relationship begins. We learn to live with the loved one we lost. We start the process of reintegration, trying to put back the pieces that have been ripped away. So I like this because, again, it reemphasizes the whole idea that while, yes, grief is the response to our having loved another, and that is honoring that love, it also acknowledges that that love carries on, and even a new relationship forms with the loved one that we've lost. Perhaps again, we didn't have the opportunity, as was mentioned by Carol prior to our starting, of some healing that occurs before that person passes away. But we can still do that healing from our side. We can still do the forgiveness, the reconciliation, whatever it is that we feel we need to do. But we're only going to do that from a place of acceptance. We're only going to do that once we have gone through some process of uh, getting to a place where we're acknowledging that this loss has occurred, and therefore we can continue to move forward and not get stuck in that grief. So these are the dimensions of acceptance. I don't know that there's a whole lot more that I need to say about acceptance. Again, we just essentially get to a place where we live with that reality of loss. And then, as David Kessler says in this final stage that he's added on, from that place of acceptance, we can actually go on to find meaning. I want to share a little bit on that in a moment, but any questions on these traditional 5 stages at this point, on depression and acceptance in particular? Comments anyone has about anything they've experienced that they want to share? And again, if you want to have things, have that microphone muted or the videotape stopped, paused, the recording paused, let me know. Yeah, Dawn, you going to share something?
Oh, hello again, Don. Yes. So I guess I'm just thinking, earlier in the teaching you were talking about, I mean, when we are in the virtue of love, like pain is not present. And yet it is in the sense that it's an expression. Our grief and our pain is an expression of our love. So on the acceptance level, I mean, because I find myself, I'll just like cry from just a lot of emotion, but it doesn't necessarily feel negative. It just feels like powerful. And I mean that in just daily life. Like if I think of the love I have for my child or my teacher or the one that has passed, I'll feel like that emotion is strong. And yet I remember in the earlier grieving stages with the people that were very close to me, I guess my question has to do with, is the greater the acceptance, is the less the pain, but still the emotion is I'm trying to work out, like, is it that the more that we accept, the less actual pain that we feel? I
Yeah,
don't know.
I think there is that dimension to it, Don. Thank you for your question. Yeah, because I don't want to pigeonhole things too much either, because I think once more our grief is going to be our own and will be our own process. And again, depending upon the circumstances of that loss, I keep going back to these people who've like lost loved ones due to murder, shootings, what have you, where they've had that sudden loss. And I'm sure even once they get to a place of some level of acceptance, the pain can still be pretty intense, I would think, because we've been wounded. There's a psychological wound that's happened there, an emotional wound, and even again, sometimes a physical wound by virtue of what we're holding in our body that still needs to process. So acceptance itself is some demarcation, some level that we get to where we can understand that this is the reality that we have to live with. But it's perhaps again at that point that the real deeper healing begins, and some of the emotions might still be very raw at that point. I don't think that we can say that once you get to acceptance that then the pain is absent, because it isn't. I don't think that that's the case at all. I think what we mean is that you have a different context in which the pain can arise, a different context where you aren't perhaps it's not leading to as much sadness that you experience on the basis of that. Sometimes there might even be a tenderness to that pain, because we think of that person and we're reminded of our love of them at the same time that we're reminded of the loss. So I think, again, it becomes more complex once we get to that point of acceptance. It doesn't necessarily erase any of that. And so it's a hard question to answer, because I don't think that there's a cookie cutter mold that we can look at and say, this is exactly how it should be for any one of us.
Well,
And some, yeah,
remember my
please.
loved ones, it's so strong, like I'll just cry,
Mhm.
but it's a lot of love. Like, it's not, I mean, I'm just so grateful that I had that connection, and since those losses, I understand that there is no actual separation. That, like, the obstacles in this reality like went away. So there's no obstacle to the connection in a way.
Right. Mhm. I think
So
it's good
I'm
to
just
honor
trying to
that.
understand like the emotion and the function of the feelings.
I think what you're pointing to, Don, and what you shared is really where it does change once we get to a place of acceptance, where it might bring out the gratitude that we have for that person in our life and having been in our life, or if we're having anticipatory grief. You mentioned about your child. Like when you look at your child and you have that understanding based on your own experience around grief, that there will come a time where one of you will lose the other, where you won't have that person in your life. That anticipatory grief does trigger, even if we've generated some acceptance of that reality, that we all will be parted from those that we love at some point, a deeper sense of gratitude, a deeper sense of love and appreciation for what we have in our lives. And that can be, again, a change in those feelings. Those feelings will still be there. They will be a bit hard, make us a little bit sad, uncomfortable perhaps, but we don't see them as kind of stopping points. We see them as doorways through which we can experience other emotions that are more positive, where we can really begin integrating another dimension of our relationship with who we lost or who we anticipate losing. Really can certainly, if you having anticipatory grief about a child that you will potentially have to be separated from, then that can make the loving relationship even stronger, I would think, right? How you relate to them and how you go about living your life with an appreciation for even the smallest moments of just sitting down and helping them with homework or doing whatever you might do with a child. Those things, I think, have become more precious, become more valuable, because we see the fleeting nature of them and we acknowledge that. That's why, again, to kind of jump from what you said back into what I talked about yesterday, and putting all of our grieving and this whole topic and the of loss and so on in the context of the Buddha's teachings when he taught the Four Noble Truths. He wasn't doing that to kind of rub our nose in it and say, look at you, you just want to wallow in your suffering. That's not the point. The point is to acknowledge what it is, to accept the truth of what it is, so that we can then use that as an opportunity to continue our spiritual development or begin our spiritual development. So all the things that you pointed to and what you said, Don, I think are important ways that we can acknowledge that when those painful feelings come up, when maybe we just have, some people might grieve at just like watching a sunset. You see this beautiful sun just departing in the sky and the darkness coming in and what have you, and it can maybe trigger all kinds of feelings. But you don't just stop there and just wallow in those feelings. You use it as, oh, this is just another indication of the impermanence of things, of the loss of things, and how I have to really use what I have in a very precious and powerful way. So I think that's what happens when we get to a place of acceptance, hopefully, is that it doesn't become kind of turned in on itself to a greater degree, but actually becomes a manifestation of how we want to be in the world, informing us. And as we see with this final stage we haven't talked about yet of finding meaning, it really can influence our sense of purpose in life, what it is that we want to accomplish while we continue to have time. Yeah. Anyway, does that help a little bit? Do you have some additional comments, Don? Or
I'm resonating with what you're saying, and like I have had such a blossoming of gratitude on the daily, every day I wake up,
Mm.
and just for my own life and the people in it now, just having, when you experience loss, when we experience loss, I think that feels like a good place to be in around it, in honor of the connection that we have, that are present and then have disappeared, from our sight or whatever. But
right.
so I'm just resonating with what you're saying.
Okay, good. And it's, again, just a reflection of what you already shared, which I think is the important thing, to acknowledge you have those tools within you to use the sense of loss as a deepening of your appreciation and gratitude for what you have, the gratefulness that we need to experience in our life. I might mention in the Book of Joy that I shared a quote from yesterday from His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. They have some exercises in there to work with gratitude because they consider gratitude to be one of what they call the 8 pillars of joy. And it's something we can practice all the time. As I said, even in psychology, scientific studies of Western psychology, they found that having moments of gratitude throughout your day has an incredible effect on your well-being, physically and mentally. So gratitude, they have an exercise, for example, of doing a gratitude journal. And I know not everybody writes, but if you even just sit down and in your own mind, journal 3 things that you can be grateful for every day, at the end of your day, at the beginning of your day, whenever you feel the need to do that or the desire to do that, really does get us back in touch with a fullness that we really should have, that we should be living our lives with, rather than the sense of scarcity and they're never I don't have enough and I don't have the people I want in my life and whatever. Be grateful for what you do have, because we all are really blessed in unbelievable ways. And even the people we've lost, as you pointed out, Don, are still with us in a sense. There is an inseparability and a connection that we have to them. And of course, the whole idea of they do live through us to some degree, because who they were and the love what they had for us and the love we have for them continues to be a part of who we are as we go about our lives. So to really honor that and express that within our own minds as well as to others and how we live our lives. So yeah, Lorna, thank you, Dawn, for all of what you shared. Yeah, Lorna, you wanted to share something?
Morning.
Hi, Lorna.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise the issue of when somebody is really suffering.
Mm.
So, for instance, someone who's deteriorating through dementia or is has a condition where they're in extreme discomfort, lots of pain, their quality of life is really low, and it's part of, they are dying. But I'm just wondering around that whole issue of wishing for it to end for them so that they're not suffering so much. So where does that fit in to sort of even more so the Buddhist way of thinking about it, of not wanting this person to suffer anymore, but knowing that death is the end of their suffering?
Yeah, it's a good point, Lorna. And, it's certainly we can say that with regard to that particular suffering that they're experiencing, which again is only one part of, I went through like the threefold levels of suffering that we went through yesterday. It's the top part, right? It's the most manifest form of suffering that is visible to us and is certainly palpable to the person who's going through it. And it triggers in us, and often we do use that first type of suffering as a way of triggering our own compassion, right? Those are where our compassion wells up initially, is because when we see that, we genuinely want that to end without a doubt, for our loved one, for all beings eventually, if we can cultivate that same compassionate wish for others. But the idea here is that it's only one part of their suffering. And so, again, the second level of just recognizing that even having pleasant experiences in their life doesn't really ultimately do the trick. And then, of course, the deepest level, that as long as they're a being who's under the control of their karma, their delusions, under control of these factors that propel them from life to life, there's no real break from suffering. As I mentioned yesterday, Rinpoche, Lama Zopa Rinpoche says, in samsara, there are no vacations. We never really get a moment, a single moment of respite from our suffering. Now, again, from the grosser forms of our suffering, absolutely. And I know that this is what often drives people, for example, to euthanize a pet that we see in great suffering and what have you, is because we're driven by compassion for that being and not wanting them to suffer in the moment. And if that's the genuine motivation behind that, or having the thoughts like you're mentioning, Lorna, of looking at a loved one who's in that pain and difficulty and wanting the end to come for them so that that suffering can be alleviated, it's okay to have those thoughts. They are compassion, but they're not seeing the whole picture. They're not understanding the deeper level of compassion that we need to have, of wanting that person, all beings, to be free from going from life to life, to be free from all of what conditions them in an unsatisfactory way. All the dukkha, all the levels of, suffering that we talk about. So again, the dukkha, this idea of a dissatisfaction that has those three components. If we only focus on the one, we're not necessarily embracing the fullness of compassion that we can have towards them. So I think there's nothing wrong with starting there, because that's a natural response, right? Who does want to see their loved one go through unbelievable pain, pain from cancer ravaging the body, or the mental anguish that goes on when dealing with dementia or other forms of mental impairment. Who wants to see that? Absolutely, you want that to be ended for that person, but just also have the understanding that it's not the whole picture of what they're going through, and deepen your compassion to also want that freedom. These are the things that play a role to some degree, even if I don't want to go too far down that, because it's a little bit taking us off of the topic of grief. But grief can be exacerbated to some degree when we have those sorts of experiences of long-term suffering and watching it in another and what have you. And it gets confusing, because then when they finally do die, then we sometimes feel guilty for having had those thoughts, of wanting them to have an end to their suffering by their passing. And yet we feel the emptiness that's there when we get to the other side and recognize that perhaps that wasn't such a healthy thought. But I think we can honor it as a healthy expression of our compassion. And of course, have that help us when we're making decisions about loved ones in terms of treatments that they might have to sustain their lives, or in the case of like animals, pets, what sorts of things we might do that make inform our decision to euthanize a pet, for example. So yeah, it looks like you wanted to say something, Carol. Share something.
Yeah, I just wanted to share, because I recently, about 2 years ago, lost a friend who was going through a lot of suffering with cancer, melanoma, and fighting that and resisting it. But then, ultimately had to succumb. And one of the things I found very helpful for me, and also it turned out to be helpful, I think, for another friend, we were both spending time with her, was the Tonglen exercise from Sogyal Rinpoche, and also Pema Chodron's work with dying. And as an exercise that just allowed this friend and I to deal with our own anxiousness and anxiety about her suffering, that exercise and practice I found to be very, very healing. And hopefully it helped her as much as it helped us as well.
Wonderful. Thanks for bringing that up, Carol. And yeah, I'm going to talk about Tonglen after we have our break.
Oh,
That'll
great.
be one of the
Okay.
things that we'll go
Thank
into,
you.
how we can use it, because Tonglen is used in our tradition as well as a way to help us to generate bodhicitta, the wish to benefit all
Exactly.
beings. So
Yeah.
yeah, Lorna, did you have anything more you wanted to share from your comment or question? No, you're okay. So we are at about an hour in, so I think this is a good place to take a break. Unless was there any, I don't want to cut off the opportunity for anyone else to share anything more, or any comments on what we've talked about. Okay, so again, let's take about a 5-minute break if people. So in terms of that last comment that I read from the book about kind of the relationship that we have with our loved ones that carries on, from acceptance, that we kind of might be redefined, might look a little bit different. I want to read one other passage. It's from the book of Finding Meaning that David Kessler wrote, page 221. He says, one of the reasons Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and I wanted to formally adopt her stages from dying to grief was because so many people misunderstood them. They saw them as a map of a relationship that would end when they finally accepted the death of their loved one. So again, when you take this model of these 5, and as I said, when they're when the original schema that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross used was around somebody coming to the acceptance of their own death. And of course, they needed to adapt it for those who were dealing with accepting the death of that person and so on. But it doesn't mean that just as when you get to the point of acceptance of your own mortality and then you die, that then it's the same for the person who's grieving, that they then get to that place of acceptance and they let go of the relationship with the person. No, I mean, the relationship continues. We continue to be influenced by their love for us, and again, our love for them. So he says here, but the 5 stages of grief were never meant to be an end unto themselves, and completion of them wasn't supposed to signify the ending of the relationship or grief. Kubler-Ross herself felt connected to people who had died and did not believe that death was an ending. I hope that by offering a 6th stage of grief, I can encourage people to understand how the continuing evolution of their relationship with the person who died will help them find their way to meaning. This is kind of where we go to in this stage. I can't possibly share everything that David Kessler talks about in this book that's really dedicated to the subject of finding meaning. But if we really do feel that strong connection to the person that we've lost, we've gotten to a place of acceptance, we've gone through more or less these 5 stages, still processing. But what will often happen is that we see new doorways opening for ourselves in terms of how do we find purpose and meaning in life. It doesn't mean that what we did prior to that death was meaningless and purposeless. It just simply means that we can use this opportunity of grief in a very profound way to open up to enriching our lives with perhaps new meaning and new purpose, or enhancing the meaning and purpose that we've already been dedicated to. So it's again a very important stage in terms of working with our grief. And let me share just a little bit, or a couple of quotes that I wanted to share from the book on the slides here, that kind of get into this final stage, the 6th stage that David Kessler added on. First of all, a quote from Pema Chodron. This was, I think, I don't know I think this was actually the 2nd book of hers that I read, When Things Fall Apart. I think I read Start Where You Are first. She was just mentioned a short while ago in terms of her teaching Tonglen frequently. This book I found myself going to when the pandemic started, because When Things Fall Apart was kind of what was going on. But she has this quote in there: our whole world falls apart, and we've been given this great opportunity. This is once more this idea that we often use in Lojong, in mind training in Tibetan Buddhism, that we look at when things are at their worst, or when we have to confront our own pain and suffering at a very deep level, that's actually an incredible doorway, an incredible opportunity. Now, again, I'm sharing that on a screen here, but that doesn't mean that for the person who's just experienced loss, if someone calls you and says, I have some news for you, my partner died, or my pet died, or whatever the case might be, you don't say, oh, your whole world's fallen apart and you've just been given this incredible opportunity. That's not what people want to hear in the moment of that processing their loss, that close to the time of that loss occurring. Over time, this may be how people can eventually look at it, as an incredible opportunity. But that's, again, the 6th stage. This is, you have to go through the other 5 to a greater degree and get to a place of acceptance before you can really use it as a springboard into finding meaning and to saying, how can I make use of this opportunity? So again, I don't want to there to be any confusion about how that should be used. This is for ourselves, and to have that understanding, if we newly experience grief in our lives, which I'm sure every one of us will do, in the remainder of our lives, how we can have that context of saying, I want to eventually get to a place where perhaps I can look at it this way. But right now, in that moment of the grief being very raw, that's not how we want to see it. And that's not the advice we want to get from other people. All right. So then I wanted to share this quote that actually I mentioned, alluded to even on the first night, I think. So this is the quote that I couldn't remember on Friday night for some reason. I started thinking about it. And then he says, bad days don't have to be your eternal destiny. That doesn't mean that your grief will get smaller over time. It means that you must get bigger. And this is this idea that you will still carry forward, as we were just speaking to in relation to Dawn's question, some level of pain, some level of anguish that we have that is our grief. Just we get bigger around it. We have more ways to utilize it, more ways to encompass it within the idea of our purpose and meaning in life. And that's what this, as this quote continues, he says, as the saying goes, no mud, no lotus. The most beautiful flower, the lotus, grows out of the mud, right? It's like, you've ever seen where they grow, they're in the dankest, darkest parts of the water, where all the mud has collected all the nutrients that are there that allow the stem of the lotus to rise up above the water, and the lotus to be born, blossoming, unsullied by the mud. But we need the mud. You don't get the lotus without the mud. Our worst moments can be the seeds of our best moments. They have an amazing power to transform us. So this is kind of where we want to be moving to in terms of the remainder of our time together today as well, is to look at the fact that it is in our grief that we actually can have incredible transformation, and the power of our grief can be very effective in doing that. I might mention as a footnote that I was really envious of this quote, "No mud, no lotus." And I don't think that David Kessler invented it. I actually saw it initially as a title of a book by Thich Nhat Hanh. But it's a wonderful analogy for what we are dealing with in terms of grief, as well as anything in our lives that we consider to be suffering. Everything is kind of rich fodder for us to be able to utilize it in our path. Again, as I said, these are the mind training, Lojong teachings that are so central in Buddhism, that Tonglen is a part of, that I'll be talking about shortly. But the idea behind them is that we want to use whatever we experience as an opportunity to channel it into some understanding of our path. And to do this, I really want to kind of give a structure to the Buddhist path in terms of three main sort of thoughts and teachings. Now, again, if you study Tibetan Buddhism and you get into what's called the Lam Rim, the stages of the path, there are many topics within that, that I might touch on a few of them as we go through these three main points. But Lama Tsongkhapa, who is the founder of the Geluk tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, identified what he called the three principal aspects of the path. If we were to call down all of that stages of the path, everything that is involved in our going from our ordinary state to the state of Buddhahood, we could say that there are three main ideas. The very first principal aspect of the path, I'm not going to go through all three initially, I'm going to go through them one at a time. The very first one is called renunciation. The Tibetan term for it actually gives a slightly different flavor for this word. The Tibetan term is nyenjong. Nyenjong literally means to emerge certainly or with definiteness. The idea is that when we begin to understand through the teachings I mentioned yesterday, the Four Noble Truths and so on, that we are caught up in this process that we call samsara, cyclic existence, going from life to life, never knowing any real peace or satisfaction, only having these fleeting moments of happiness that then, we lose and we experience suffering, and we have just this cycle that is propelled by our own karma and delusions. When we think about that, we have this desire to emerge from that, to be free from that, to do that with definiteness, to be certain that this is what we are intent upon accomplishing. This encompasses the first two levels of our stages of the path, the Lam Rim teachings, but those are essentially self-compassion. I like how the Buddhist path is built on initially looking at our own situation, understanding our own experience in terms of the Buddhist teachings, how it is through the force of our own deluded minds that we then create our karma, karmic actions being then the process by which we have experiences that are unsatisfactory. But that there can be an end to all of this, as I said yesterday with the Four Noble Truths, there can be a cessation of all of that when we practice the path that undoes all of that mechanism, that doesn't allow that to then, occur. It's all based in the idea of a causal process. We are involved in what we are involved in due to causes and conditions, and we will be free of what we are involved in if we enact different causes and conditions, things that are in opposition to what we are currently doing. So the idea behind renunciation, or this thought of definite emergence, is the idea that we are sick to death of our own suffering, of our own dukkha, our own unsatisfactory state of existence, and we want to be out of it. We want to be free of it. So how do we use our grief in regard to that? Well, once more, the rawness of our grief, the sadness of our grief, the depression of our grief, the difficulty of our grief, the mere fact that we have to lose those that we love in our lives, speaks to the unsatisfactory nature of samsara. Again, in that moment, we might just simply want freedom from that pain and might not be thinking about anything bigger than that. Just like when Lorna's question, we might want freedom from the pain that our loved one is experiencing in that moment and not think about the other dimensions of their suffering, their dukkha. But eventually we do have to keep channeling that, funneling that into generating a deeper and deeper awareness of our own individual situation, and having a compassion that embraces our well-being to that degree, that really doesn't just want us to be free of the sadness of grief, wants us to be free from the entire unsatisfactory nature of existence. Now, as I said, when we get to that place, I talked about this a little bit yesterday, where we are a more fully evolved being, where we are kind of transcending a lot of that, it doesn't mean that you don't experience the sense of loss that occurs when people go out of your life. It just means you have a bigger context in which you can know that, and it doesn't become a burden to bear. It actually enhances our compassion and our, sense of purpose and what have you. I'm going to go into that in more detail when we get to the next of these principal aspects. But the idea is that everything is grist for the mill. Everything that you experience in your life, and in particularly grief, is an opportunity for you to wake up to that reality, to renunciation, and to the need to develop that intention to be liberated from our state of existence once and for all. So in terms of this topic of using grief on the path, here's a quote that kind of is from, and I'm going to use quotes occasionally from A Buddhist Grief Observed, which is a really wonderful short little book by Guy Newland, who's an amazing Buddhist scholar in our tradition. He says, to love others, we must love ourselves, wish well for ourselves, and then gradually learn to see others as similar cases of beings who, just like ourselves, want happiness and don't want suffering. But the first step, loving ourselves, can be notoriously hard. I think this is I do often see, I talked about this concept of bypassing grief and this spiritual bypassing that John Wellwood mentions as something that people coming to the Buddhist path might often do. This is one form of spiritual bypassing where we kind of go, I'm not interested in my own suffering and looking at my own stuff. I really want to be there for others. I know when I came to these teachings, because of a lot of the work I'd done around HIV in San Francisco, I'd developed this real sincere desire to help others, and was really motivated when I found Sogyal Rinpoche's book to say, this is what I want to do with my life, is to be of greater benefit to others. But if I don't look at my own situation, then I'm going to be blind to the fullness of the situation of others, right? We have to be able to see our own suffering. We have to be able to have love and compassion for ourselves. And as Guy Newland says, it's notoriously hard. In the Lojong teachings, they say, with the process of Tonglen that we're going to go into shortly, that you begin Tonglen with yourself, that you actually look at your own situation first, and you want yourself to be free from that, and to have yourself achieve your greatest level of happiness and well-being. Then we can translate that to others. And it makes sense, right? When we hear it this way, we know, well, this is how we do it, right? We have to kind of, take care of ourselves before we can ideally take care of others. Doesn't mean we become self-obsessed and totally about ourselves. It means that we acknowledge that without looking at our own situation first, are we really going to be in the best situation to work with others, to help them? So this idea of this first step that these three principal aspects encompass is so important. Developing our own determination ourselves to be free from the situation that we find ourselves in. When we see through the Buddhist teachings and understand the depth to which we have been involved in samsara since beginningless time, and that we really want to ideally be free from that. That's genuine compassion for ourselves. It's not just wanting us to be free from an individual moment of pain or difficulty. It's wanting to be free once and for all from all of it. But it doesn't stop there. The second principal aspect of the path is bodhicitta. Most of us have heard this word before. Bodhi means the same root word for Buddha. It means to awaken or to kind of attain an enlightened state. And citta is the mind that aspires to do that. So we have citta, mind, and bodhi, awaken, the awakening mind, the mind of enlightenment. This is the motivation that drives you to become a Buddha. It's not, we don't say bodhicitta is the mind of the Buddha. It's the mind of the person who is a bodhisattva, striving to become a Buddha, or even prior to becoming a bodhisattva, developing that strong intention to translate what one has learned through the initial stages of the path, through developing renunciation, to all beings, to recognize that we're all in that predicament. Guy Newland even alluded to that in that quote I shared. We want to start with love and compassion for ourselves, and then be able to translate that to all beings. And of course, bodhicitta is a mind that is based on the idea of encompassing the welfare of every single sentient being, including those beings that we find utterly repulsive, disgusting, who we just cannot believe the things that they do in this world. In fact, those should be even greater objects of our compassion and concern, because we see the depth to which they are suffering and under the control of their deluded minds. So to develop bodhicitta, there are a couple of techniques that we can use to do that. One of them involves 7 steps that you use as sort of a cause and effect relationship. You start off with sort of seeing every being as being somewhat close to you, and then recognizing the kindness that they showed you when they were in that role of being close to you, such as your own mother. And then thirdly, developing a wish to repay that kindness. That gets funneled into loving kindness and compassion, which we develop as a part of bodhicitta without a doubt. Those are the primary motivating factors that cause us to want to become a Buddha for the sake of others, is our love that wants them to be happy and wants to place them in that happiness, our compassion that wants them to be free from suffering and wants to remove their suffering. And then we develop a really sincere, deep resolve to do that, that channels into this mind of bodhicitta. Again, I don't have time to go through all the steps involved in that technique, but all of the stages of the path texts that are out there, what are called the Lam Rim texts, those are all embracing this concept as our final goal. And so they give very detailed teachings on how to accomplish that. But the other technique is rooted in this idea of mind training, Lojong, that I was talking about earlier. And that's where Tonglen is presented. Because we have an acknowledgement that one of the deepest kind of faulty minds that we have in our being is what's called our self-centeredness, our self-cherishing, is the recognition that we are tending to live our lives from the point of view of me, myself, and I, and my needs being more important than the needs of others. This is the biggest block to bodhicitta, according to this second technique. We have to first see that we and others are equal, and that the way that I want myself to be happy and free from suffering is no different from the way Vanessa does, and Lorna does, and Carol does, and Dawn does, and Christopher does, and Whitney does, and Brian and Ryan do. Every being we look at, whether it be, again, someone who's up to unbelievable mayhem in this world, or the most devout, holy person we see in this world, we're all driven similarly. We all desire happiness and want to be free from suffering. So how can I say, even at that first stage, that my happiness and my well-being is more important than anyone else's? Because we're all equal in that desire. Moreover, we're also all equal in the potential to have that. In the Mahayana teachings of Buddhism, we say every being has Buddha nature, meaning that we're not already a Buddha. We have the nature, the raw stuff from which Buddhahood can arise. The development of our minds completely, where we have removed everything that obscures our minds and developed fully all the qualities, compassion, loving kindness, and wisdom, and so on. This is a potential that every being possesses: a caterpillar, a butterfly, a horse, a cow, as well as all the beings in all the realms of existences. Every being, by virtue of having a mind, has that potential, that Buddha nature. So when we look at any being, we see that that is the potential they have. They aren't necessarily able to actualize that potential right now, but they are a Buddha in the making. They are simply a being who is in the process of eventually attaining that state. So there's no difference between myself and others in our potential to achieve that, nor is there any difference in our desire to find the peace and happiness that we seek. So that's the initial understanding. But then again, we see that the big block to that is our tendency to be solely focused on me, myself, and I, and my own welfare. Thereby, we need a technique to begin to annihilate that self-centeredness and to adopt a mind that cherishes others, that holds them dear. That's the real spirit of bodhicitta. So let me talk a little bit about Tonglen, because what I would encourage you to do is to use this as a tool to work with eventually with your own grieving or the suffering of another. If you're sitting at the bedside, I actually use this technique shortly after learning it, just like Carol did from Sogyo Rinpoche's book, Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. I used it at the bedside of a friend of mine who was dying of AIDS as well in 1993. I didn't have those tools when Ed passed away in 1992 because I hadn't yet found Buddhism. But it's a wonderful tool to use in the face of any suffering that we experience or that we see in another. It also is a tool to use when you experience happiness or see happiness in others. So it's not just oh, I'm going to just be on the side of the dark, depressing, suffering stuff. It's also a tool to use when we see happiness, when we experience that. So let's talk about the basic elements of Tonglen, because there are a variety of ways to practice it. Again, Pema Chodron has her techniques she teaches and so on. But it's a way of essentially enlarging on two main ideas. The loving kindness that is a response to beings wanting to be happy, ourselves included, and the compassion that is a response to beings wanting to not suffer, again, ourselves included. But what it's kind of how it's going to work with is work with those two ideas is with the idea that we want to use those thoughts to get rid of this block to our heart being fully open. Pema Chodron says that all of us, I think she got this from her teacher, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, the idea that we all have sort of a soft spot. I point here because, again, this is sort of said to be the seat of consciousness in Tibetan Buddhism. But we have this sort of soft spot that is our true being. We could even identify that to some degree with our Buddha nature. This is the place we want to be able to operate from. But this mind of self-centeredness and other delusions have armored that soft spot, have kept us from being truly in touch with it. We want to sort of target that and get rid of that hard exterior and find that soft spot within ourselves through the method of Tonglen. Okay, so what are the key elements of Tonglen? We begin, even though it's Tong is actually giving and Len is taking, we begin with the taking and then we engage in the giving. How do we engage in taking? Well, we begin with looking at some suffering. Now, as was said, earlier on, it is good to start with Tonglen for yourself. So we can think about ourselves in our current situation. Those of you who are grieving, for example, at this time, in a more active form of grieving around a loss of a loved one, what have you, you can visualize yourself in front of you in that state of grief that you're experiencing. Kind of take on that more objective look at ourselves. We're not going to be the subjective person sitting there that we're observing. We're going to be the person who is objectively looking at our own suffering. And we start with ourselves and we acknowledge that we would like that suffering to be gone. How wonderful it would be if we ourselves were free from that suffering. How wonderful it would be, if we knew some deeper sense of peace in the midst of that. And then we generate the thought of, may I experience that? May this being, again, that I'm visualizing in front of me, that is me in my own grief, may I be free of that. And then eventually we get to a place where we generate what's called the great compassion that wishes to remove that suffering for that being. Again, here it's ourselves and our own current suffering. You can also, of course, use yourself in your past suffering or future suffering, but the idea is to work with yourself first. Generate these thoughts of compassion. Again, how wonderful if that being was free of that. May they be free of that. That's kind of a decree, a little bit more forceful. And then finally, I will free you from that suffering. This is what bodhicitta is really kind of built upon, is that altruistic intention to actually free that being from suffering by becoming an active force in the lives of others through becoming a Buddha. Okay, so that's how we enhance our compassion. Then we engage in a technique of visualizing that we're taking away the suffering of that being into ourselves. You may wonder, well, why would I want to do that? Again, because we see that this is the manifestation of that wish to free the suffering, to be willing to take it on ourselves so we can get rid of the biggest obstacle to that, which once more is our self-centeredness. Is our tendency to be focused on, I don't want that, right? Thank you very much. I don't want that suffering. I point out how this can manifest in even very subtle ways when we're driving. I'm assuming most of you drive, but perhaps have driven. And no doubt you've been on the freeway or some road somewhere at one time and you saw somebody pulled over getting a speeding ticket, right? Do you ever have the thought, oh, I wish that were me getting that speeding ticket instead of the other person? No, you'd be like, wow, I'm glad that I dodged that bullet, because most of us tend to speed a little. I mean, maybe we aren't speeding as much as that person did, but we probably have at one time or another. So we've been that person that could have been pulled over, but we never have the thought of, oh, I feel so sorry for that person getting a ticket. I wish that were me instead of them. It's a very subtle way that we see the self-centeredness, but it manifests in even more overt ways that cause us to be blind to the suffering of others. that cause us to put our own needs as more important and potentially even harm others to get what we want and what we desire. So this is what we're trying to annihilate. When we take on that suffering, we kind of want to place that suffering on that state of mind. And in our tradition, we even have this idea of visualizing that self-centeredness as kind of a lump or a rock here at the center of our chest, very uncomfortable. We want to get rid of it. We want to destroy it. But what's the most powerful thing to destroy it? Is to go against its wishes, which is to say, I'm going to take that suffering on. I'm going to take that ticket. I'm going to take whatever it is that, others are experiencing. Again, here we're going to start with working with ourselves. So it's a closed circle, right? Closed circuit. We're only going to be taking on the suffering that we ourselves are already experiencing. But we're going to do this as an exercise to kind of shape the muscle of compassion so that we can eventually take on the suffering of others. So we visualize taking that suffering away from, again, ourselves and our current grief or whatever it is we're experiencing, and we place it on this self-cherishing mind in our heart. And we think that it becomes destroyed by virtue of that. Now, I do this in a very gradual way. I don't like bring it all in and immediately it's destroyed like that. Rather, I bring it in a bit at a time so that we take away a bit more suffering. And every time we take a bit more suffering, it annihilates more of this self-centeredness. But work with it as you wish. Again, there's a lot of license we could take with this practice of Tonglen, and various teachers will teach it in various ways. But that's the gist of this practice, is to take away the suffering of whoever it is you're visualizing, again, starting with yourself, and place it on the mind of self-cherishing. Annihilate that strong tendency that we have to resist our experience of things ourselves, to think that we're most important and our freedom from suffering, our happiness is more important than others. Now, you can also combine it with the breath, and they often teach you to do that later, but you can certainly from the beginning use your breath. Breathe in that suffering, and you can visualize it in the form of a very thick, hot smoke that is very uncomfortable. You don't want to think about it as something that's, nice and delicious and delightful. Think about taking that into yourself. What would it be like to breathe that in and bring it down to your heart center and annihilate this self-cherishing, this self-centeredness? When you get to a place where you feel that you've done that completely and you feel good about what you've accomplished in removing that suffering and in removing the self-centeredness as well, then you turn to the giving side of it. And this is where we enhance our loving kindness, our love for ourselves. Because even though we've now been free of that pain of grieving or whatever suffering we're experiencing, we're still not at the point of experiencing the fulfillment of our being to a greater degree, the kind of bliss and joy and happiness that we can experience. So we turn our attention once more to the object of our meditation, in this case, ourselves. We're free of that grief, or the suffering from that grief, but now we're still bereft of happiness. So we start generating loving kindness in terms of those same types of thoughts. First, how wonderful it would be if I had all means of happiness and causes of happiness, a true state of bliss and well-being. May I have that happiness and all the causes of that. And then finally, what makes it great love, I myself will do that. I will place this being in happiness. Again, here it's yourself, but you're generating that thought of loving kindness to that degree where you're going to take responsibility for that. Once you generated loving kindness to that degree in this thought process, then you engage in the process of giving your happiness to that being. In this case, it's you giving your happiness to yourself, but it's an exercise once more to strengthen the muscle of your loving kindness so that you can then have that for others. Now, for this, there's different visualizations you can do. Lama Zopa Rinpoche says, think now that your entire being, your body and what have you, has been transformed into a wish-fulfilling jewel. And you begin to send this out, wishing for the well-being of that person in front of you. And you can do that in the form of light, bright light, or rainbow-colored light, whatever light works for you. I sometimes like to visualize that my heart center is a wish-fulfilling jewel. In the place of where that mind of self-cherishing was, that was this hard rock, this hard mass, now is this beautiful, multifaceted, crystal clear jewel. And I'm going to infuse all of my happiness, all the good karma I've created, even my own body, all the resources I have, everything that contributes to my own happiness in any way, shape, or form. I'm going to make that light that is infused into this wish fulfilling jewel at my heart center. And I'm going to begin to send that light out to that being in front of me. And as I send it out, when it meets that being, it becomes what they need in the moment to bring them temporal happiness and well-being, as well as eventually ultimate happiness and well-being. Sending out, just comforts for to have good health, to have everything that they need in this life, and then to eventually send them the Dharma and teachings and teachers and everything that will help them to develop their minds completely so they can eventually taste the true bliss that is their birthright, that is their Buddha nature. And you just do this as a process. As I said, I find it really beneficial to do it gradually. Keep sending out a bit more of that light with more willingness to give that away to others. And then eventually you get to a place where you've totally given it away, and the being in front of you, which in this case was yourself, is now in a state of complete well-being, has reached that state of bliss that is Buddhahood. Again, you can do this with the breath, breathing out that white light to that being in front of you. Okay, so it would be the same technique that we do once we've worked with ourselves to some degree. We do the same technique with others. We think about others and their grief and their sorrow and their suffering, and we bring them to mind. And as Carol pointed out, this is a very powerful technique if you're working with someone who is in pain and dying, or even just dealing with pain from whatever illness or mental anguish. You sit thinking of them. You don't have to be in their presence, but it's powerful if you can do it in their presence. And you can do this completely silently. You don't have to advertise it to them or to the world. You don't have to get everyone in the hospital involved. If you feel they're open to that, well, that's fine. But I'm guessing most of them may not be. This is something you can do very privately. I often talked about this being kind of a secret teaching because most people aren't ready for this revolutionary idea of putting others before yourself so completely. But you just sit there and silently do this. Think about their pain, their suffering, and really generate that compassion that wants to free them from that. And then engage in the exercise of visualizing taking that away, the willingness to take their pain onto yourself and place it on this mind of self-cherishing, and then the willingness to give what you have to bring them to the apex of their well-being and happiness. So again, that's what we're trying to cultivate in this meditation of Tonglen. That feeds into the same sort of altruistic intention to be dedicated to the welfare of all beings that manifests in bodhicitta, that manifests in our desire to become a Buddha, to be able to help others to that degree. One thing about this whole thing of engaging in these practices of developing compassion and loving kindness to this degree is that we aren't capable of actually freeing others from their suffering and placing them in happiness yet. And even as a Buddha, you will be somewhat still limited in that a Buddha is a being who no longer has any, obstacles to helping others. From their side, they can help others as fully as is needed. The problem is from the side of the beings who are being helped, we have great obstacles. Most beings have karmic obstacles, have an inability to be helped to the degree that they would ideally need to be. But still, having said that, Buddhas don't have the ability to place all beings in a state of Buddhahood just through their strong intentions. I mean, the proof is because we're not there yet. I mean, I'm not there yet. I don't know about all of you. You may be Buddhas, but I'm not enlightened. So I know that the Buddhas don't have the power to enlighten all beings just like that through their strong compassion and loving kindness. Instead, they become active forces in the world to help others by teaching them the Dharma, by giving them the instruction that they can apply in their lives and achieve enlightenment themselves. So again, Buddhas are not sort of an omnipotent being who can immediately do whatever they wish. But from their side, they have nothing but the intention to benefit others. From that place of wisdom and compassion and all the other skills and abilities they have, they know exactly how to benefit others. It's up to us to be in a position where we can benefit from them. But the goal of achieving that is important. Why? So that we can be that force in others' lives, so that we can actually be a manifestation of that enlightened energy and activity in the world and help others on their path of awakening. So that's, in a nutshell, how I would encourage you working with grief in terms of it supplementing your compassion for yourself and loving kindness towards yourself as well as for others. so that it can be eventually manifested in bodhicitta, in this second principal aspect of the path that is so important on the Mahayana in particular. It's our desire to achieve our greatest potential so we can then help others. And every one of us, again, can do that because we all have Buddha nature. We give a little, kind of little time maybe here to insert the idea of Buddha nature. Buddha nature, the analogy I often use is a glass of water. You know, that when we have a glass of water that is pure, we can see the clarity of it, right? That is its natural state. But if I go and take a couple of spoonfuls of dirt and throw it in the water and, you know, kind of mix it up, we see how opaque it gets, right? The clarity is gone. The impurities have, for the time being, removed that clarity. But is that clarity really gone? It's only gone because it's not manifested. It's there in a dormant state. If we take that dirty glass of water and we run it through purifiers, you know, we might have to do a couple of purification cycles to get all the subtle dirt out of it. The clarity of the water is there again, right? It was always there. It's just not manifest. Our minds are like that. Our minds are fundamentally clear, fundamentally pure. They're just muddied by all of the crazy thoughts that we have, all of our ignorance, all of our attachment, our desire, our jealousy, our greed, our hatred, our anger. All of those things are the dirt that can be removed. We go back to the Four Noble Truths. That's the fourth one. The true path that leads to the end of your suffering is a process of purification, a process of removing everything that sullies the mind, and to eventually achieve a complete manifestation of all of the qualities that are direct opposition to that, all of the compassion and wisdom and kindness and patience and generosity and so on. So essentially, this is what the Buddhist path is all about, is achieving that goal ourselves so we can help others to achieve that goal. So if we can use our grief when we're in a place, again, of deeper acceptance, perhaps, I wouldn't, again, encourage people to work with these teachings right from the get-go, but to manifest some sense of concern for others, some altruistic intention. Guy Newland in his book does talk a lot about kind of how that does manifest in terms of taking care of others. He has a whole chapter there just called simply Taking Care. And many people speak to this. Again, I can't cite so many things from Finding Meaning by David Kessler because it's rich with all of these stories. But many people, when they go through that process of working with their grief and loss, they manifest it in terms of compassionate action towards others, and they find some of the deepest healing there. I have no doubt that many of these people who are dedicated to doing something that was motivated by the loss of their loved one, they find incredible richness in their lives by virtue of that. I mean, I can speak to that myself. I became a Buddhist teacher out of my finding Buddhism after Ed's passing, and that whole world opening up to me and my desire to help others through sharing these teachings with them. You know, so we all have that potential through our grief to become more altruistic, to become, have that dimension of our lives that's of service to others, become more manifest. Again, it doesn't have to look like that. Going back to this sixth stage of grief, finding meaning can also mean that we find ways of fulfilling ourselves that might be of greater benefit to others in a more indirect way. So don't think that I have to necessarily do something altruistic to make meaning out of my loved one's passing or out of my own grief, but rather acknowledge that that is another dimension. But the first of the three principal aspects was self-compassion, renunciation. That's a good place to start. You know, how do we really work on ourselves and treat ourselves better so that we do continue our own spiritual development? But then how can we, if we can see the potential for that and really, you know, explore it in our lives, how do we work with the helping others spiritually as well, or helping others in whatever way we can to alleviate their suffering to some degree? That's the second principal aspect of the path, bodhicitta. The third one, I'm not going to have time to talk about so much, but I think it is important that we touch on it briefly. It is talked about in Guy Newland's book, and I'll read his passage on it because he didn't find it particularly helpful, at least in his initial stages of grief. It's what's called the wisdom of emptiness. Again, many of you have had teachings on emptiness. Emptiness is greatly misunderstood in Buddhism as well. It's not meaning nothingness. In fact, some students often ask me, you know, well, isn't emptiness also pointing to fullness? At some level, we can say that. Things are empty of a particular way of existing that we are right now adhering to very strongly. When we go back to that whole process of samsara and the deepest cause of our suffering, we see that what it's rooted in is an ignorance that grasps at things as if they existed in an intrinsic, inherent way, meaning that they exist from their own side. You know, when I hold this up to you, you immediately, because we all have come to know what a book is, it seems as if the bookness is established out here in this object that I'm holding in my hand. When in reality, all that has happened is that the causes and conditions for book, the parts of book, the basis for book, have come together, and then we label this as book. We give it that designation. And we do that out of convenience, right? Because we have to be able to talk about books and computers and chairs and tables and people and, emotions and, ignorance, all the various things that we identify through labeling. We have to be able to give them that identification. But that is the only way that they exist, is through our identifying them as that. In other words, there's no real book in my hand. There's the basis that we designate as book, and the label we give to book is ascribed properly because we conventionally agree that this is a perfectly good label for what I have in my hand. But there's no book from the side of what's in my hand. Its bookness is not from the side of this object. Its bookness comes from my thinking of it as book. And maybe you even had a dog that got into a book when it was a puppy, right? Dogs love to chew on things, and they might have thought that this was a great opportunity for them to exercise their jaws and get their teeth into something as their teeth were developing. They didn't see it as a book. We might have looked at it and go, oh, Don, the puppy's chewing on your book. Well, that's our conception. But the dog doesn't see it as book. For the dog, it's a good basis for chewing, right? This kind of points to the fact that there's nothing from the side of these objects that determines what they are. We determine that conventionally through language, but through our conceptualization, our designating things, imputing things, labeling things. That's probably the most to say about emptiness, because when we say the word emptiness, it's speaking to the fact that things lack that way of existing kind of on their own, self-instituting, setting themselves up. And that's what this very profound concept of emptiness is referring to, is simply that lack that we don't see in things. Instead, we think that they are established from their own side. But it's within this sphere of emptiness, this understanding that this is the way things exist, that actually everything does exist. That's where we can speak to the fullness of things. Emptiness is not nihilistic. It's not nothingness. It's simply an understanding of how things actually do exist that allows for the diversity of things to manifest. This is a profound truth that we struggle with constantly, that we eventually have to get on our path. That's the third principal aspect. And it's an important one, because without that correct understanding, you not only can't achieve Buddhahood, but you also can't even achieve your own liberation. If you aspired just to do that, if you simply developed renunciation, and then you needed this wisdom of emptiness to achieve your goal of your own liberation, regardless of whether you have bodhicitta. With bodhicitta, it becomes even more critical, because then it's not just your well-being that is hinged on your understanding of emptiness, it's also the well-being of all sentient beings. So then we, again, struggle with emptiness. So I'm going to read the little passage that Guy Newland talks about, because in this book, Buddhist Grief Observed, he talks about different teachings from Buddhism, because the premise for it is that he had one person that he knew that kind of asked him, what was the Dharma helping him? And what helped, and how much, and in what ways? As a Buddhist teacher that Guy Newland was, who wrote the book, he was asked by somebody, well, are these Buddhist teachings helping you in your grief? Are they giving you something that you can actually use in your grief? Again, the caring for others, or even developing a strong attention to ourselves, as was already talked about with renunciation and bodhicitta. Those are evidently, things that we can tackle with this. But is emptiness something that would actually be useful on our path? It's on page 35 that he talks about this. He says, in the Buddhist tradition, this section is actually called Who Dies? In the Buddhist tradition, we say that in the flow of change, there is never any fixed thing we can point out that corresponds to the things named by our language. Just like the book, we have this thing we think is a real book from its own side. But if we go looking for it, we see there's no real book here. There's only the basis for us labeling book, giving it that designation. He says it's useful to think of things and people as though they had fixed identities, but they don't. They are like fast rushing streams, and a table is just what we call a certain collection of table parts, none of which is itself a table. Just like this is what we call book, but is any part of this a book? Is the front cover a book? Is the back cover a book? Are any of the pages a book? Is the binding a book? Is the writing on the page a book? Book is what we are designated to, this collection of stuff. The label book and this basis for that labeling. So he says everything and person is what it is only in relation to a perspective, a point of view. Nothing exists as this or that from its own side. So everyone and everything is empty of existing in the way we usually see them. So then he goes on and he says, so it is that when someone asked me in the early months whether my familiarity with Buddha's teachings on emptiness had consoled me in my grief, my reflexive answer was just no. All I could think was that Valerie, his wife, empty or not, was definitely around here before, and now she is definitely not. And that hurts. So he says to deny this is to miss the middle way. Those who think emptiness cancels out this fact cannot have understood. Valerie was here, now she is not. This is true and it hurts. It must not be denied. But this is not the only thing that is true. Again, so we have this idea that if we use the emptiness teachings not to deny or negate what it is that we're experiencing, but to give a different context for the I who is grieving, the person who is lost, a deeper understanding that it is through this causal process of our grasping at the opposite, at the wrong way of looking at things, that all of this happens, that all of our samsaric experiences are unfolding. Then we gain once more a deeper understanding of the entire process. It reinforces our bodhicitta and our renunciation, and it makes us even more intent upon finding that meaning in our lives, that purpose in our lives that is to achieve Buddhahood, that is to be of greater benefit to others beyond what we currently can do. Obviously, Guy Newland talks more about it there, but I'm going to leave it at that. But those three teachings, I think we can see that there may be some benefit certainly to each of them, the first two more perhaps than the last, but we have to be careful about what teachings we use and when we use them at particular times in our grieving. He does have one section in here where he talks about karma. I've touched on karma a bit over the weekend. It's not so useful, again, to somebody who's experiencing the loss of someone very dear to them to say, well, that was their karma. They had to go that way, Nobody wants to hear that, right? There's an understanding, maybe an explanation that karma provides for why things happen. That's what karma is meant to do. It's a process of cause and effect. You have an effect that has occurred. You can see that there are causes that led to that. If you don't want that effect to occur, you stop creating the causes. If you want some effect to actually happen, then you do create the causes. It's a simple observation of cause and effect. But for the person who's grieving, doesn't matter, right? That's not so important. They don't need to be told that this karmic process is what they're experiencing and unfolding and what have you. In fact, it might even be, misused to provide those karma teachings at that time. I think it would be an abuse of the Buddha's teachings to some degree. So we have to be careful in applying this to ourselves, but certainly even in applying it to others. One of the most important things that we do, especially for people who are newly in grief, is simply to be present with it, to keep our own hearts open. And maybe again, Tonglen or other Buddhist techniques of mindful awareness and so on can be useful for us to be able to be with those who are in deep grief and to even be with our own grief. But again, we will find time, hopefully, in our process to be able to open up to utilizing the teachings of the Buddha to even greater degrees. And especially those ways of getting out of perhaps our own kind of self-centered focus to be able to look at others and how we might benefit them, how we might use our own experience as a platform to and help others to find peace and happiness as well. So let's see if there are any questions. I do have like one or two slides to share at the tail end of this, like just maybe some nice concluding thoughts. But any comments or questions on anything I've gone through, especially in this last part, looking at these three principal aspects, Buddha's teachings, how we gain some understanding of that? And I know the emptiness one's really hard, because when we say that in emptiness, there's no person who dies, there's no person who's grieving, all this, it doesn't mean that conventionally those don't exist. They do. The person did die. We did experience that loss. We are grieving. But there's a deeper truth and reality that's underneath the surface that we can be open to. And when we have the proper time in our lives to process the grief through that, the window of that teaching on emptiness, it could be quite profound. All right. No other comments or questions?
I don't have
Yeah,
a question.
Vanessa. Yeah.
I have more of a comment.
Okay.
It's, now that there's more time that has lapsed since my mom passed away, I feel like grieving gets easier, or living life, knowing that my mom is not here presently. But it's always good just to have these refreshing teachings, especially when it pertains to Buddhism, the Buddhist perspective on grief. So I just want to say that it's been really helpful. You going over these slides, even you taught them similar slides last year. It helps just to revisit them and just get them drilled in my mind.
Good. Yeah, I recall, Vanessa. I mean, it was last July, and yeah, the freshness of the loss of your mother was very different then. And I do think that that's the value of the Buddhist teachings as well. I mean, I've certainly have noticed that when I go back to look at teachings like Sogyal Rinpoche's book, that was my first Tibetan Buddhist book, and how the lens I read that teaching through when I was going through my own grief is very different from how I would look at those teachings now. And I think that's the wonder of Buddhism, the miracle of Buddhism, if you will. And maybe that's true about all spiritual traditions. We hear them differently, the teachings differently at different times. And certainly when we talk about this process of grief that we are involved in, every one of us to some degree, we see that the teachings resonate in different ways at different times, and we hear different things. So know that, again, we've recorded all of these teachings for the benefit of people to be able to go back and have a look at them. I don't know, you'll be storing them, I guess, at the website for Gonpo Ludup.
Yes,
Correct?
the YouTube channel.
Yeah, so they will be out there for access, so people can go back to them and revisit them, and you might find some benefit in doing that. But again, there are many other resources. One thing I thought about doing, I touch on a number of books, and maybe I'll put together a little reading list of sorts that I'll get to Vanessa as well. And I also want to provide people with although there weren't that many slides, a copy of the slides in a PDF format that you can have. And maybe I'll throw in the self-compassion meditation, the meditation from Jack Kornfield on grief that I shared a brief part of, any other handouts that I had or things that I referred to, so that you have that. But know that this is an important topic to revisit and to go back to, and to refresh our own kind of appreciation for what Buddhism has to offer as we work with our own grief, whatever that might look like. Every one of us is a human being. We're all going to experience a variety of losses in our lives. And some of them might be more profound than others, and it might be difficult to navigate them. But we do have some tools to help us, with navigating through that grief. So, yeah. Did you want to share something, Brian? You look like you're moving towards your computer.
Yeah, Don, I just wanted to thank you so much for the time that we had with you, and I was just curious if there's some way I could stay in touch in that be like, what are you doing next? How can I know when you're taking teaching?
Yeah, I do have a website, donhandrick.com. You can find that out there. And I do have a schedule that I just recently updated. I can let people know that I'm not doing a whole lot more teachings this year. I'll be in Florida for 2 weeks doing teachings that will be online. As I mentioned, I'm going to do this workshop in 2 sessions on a Saturday for them. So it'll be a little bit different in terms of what material I choose to use, because I won't have quite as much time to work with. But I'm doing a number of other single teachings. They're not really a set of teachings over those 2 weeks. They decided just to have me do a single topic for each time I teach. And that's out there at that website at my schedule. Then after that, I'm going off to Spain for 5 weeks. I had been invited to Spain back in 2020 to do some teachings there. And I didn't get a chance to do that, obviously, because of the pandemic. So they kept kind of inviting me and wanting me to come out. And this year, things finally fell into place for me to be able to go. I just put my website address in there in case you need that. I'll be also putting in the chat box my email address in case you want to stay in touch with me personally. Just know that sometimes it takes me a while because of travel and what have you to get back in touch with people. So the teachings in Spain, because of the time difference, I don't think there'll be any, live online accessibility for people, outside of Spain. Maybe people from the individual centers where I'm teaching might be able to do that. After that, I'm actually going to take what I'm calling a sabbatical. We don't have this term in Tibetan Buddhism so much, but I've decided to take a little break from teaching to do some other practices and self-study. As a teacher, I haven't really had much time for any of that over the past, 17 years roughly. It's been since 2005 that I've been teaching, and I would generally take about 2 weeks for retreat each year. And I'd like to take a little bit longer retreat. So I'm taking 6 months off. I'm not going to do a full 6-month retreat, but I'd like to at least do a month or two. So I won't be back in the teaching circuit after I get back in November 7th, until probably around beginning of May 10th, 11th, something like that. I think I'll start teaching again. So there's not a lot of access to me right now. There are recordings of me out on YouTube that if you want to look at, what have you, but I'm not so much into advertising myself. I have a website simply out of convenience for people to be able to know where I am teaching. But right now I'm just in a kind of a different situation with that break from teaching coming up. So I'm fine with letting people know that that's what's going to be happening for the next period of time. So, but anyway, yeah. There are some links to some of the videos at my website, but I haven't been able to keep up with that. With the pandemic, obviously, there were so many more things recorded, right? All these centers had invited me to do teachings from a distance. And so some of them have them at their own website. Some of them, they posted it as a general YouTube video that was accessible, through that. But there's a lot of stuff out there, obviously. Does that help, Brian?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Good. All right. Well, thank you for your comments. And I'm really grateful that people were able to come together for this weekend and do this little exploration on grief and loss. Any other comments from anybody before I give the last few little concluding thoughts?
Just thank you so much. It was really, really, thank you.
You're welcome, Carol. Thanks so much for your participation. And I'm just grateful for the opportunity to do this. So let me share some concluding thoughts and quotes from other people. Guy Newland, again, going back to a Buddhist grief observed, he says, to be human is to set sail for the next shipwreck. I don't want to be discouraging and end on like a downer note. That's not really meant to be. It's just, it's preparatory, be ready for the reality that this is what we have as our human condition, that grief is potentially right around the corner. Yeah. Okay. And then one that's maybe a little bit more positive from Lao Tzu, new beginnings are often disguised as painful endings, to always have that sort of maybe more optimistic view that we never know, what's on the other side of a painful ending. I always like to keep that sort of optimistic view. I know we were talking earlier about optimism, pessimism, what have you, but I have found in my own life, certainly with what I shared with you and Ed's passing and my having this whole dimension to my life that is my life now, come from that experience, that this whole phrase of seeing the silver lining in any dark cloud is really important, to look at everything that we meet eventually, again, when it's happening and when we're in the kind of the throes of that difficult pain and what have you, it won't be what we want to hear or necessarily what we want to even tell ourselves. But over time, to recognize that everything has that potential. It's up to us to utilize that in that way, to frame our thoughts and our behaviors around that idea that everything can be an incredible new beginning. This is how we actually grow and develop. And that's where, again, I hope that some of that's come across in what I've shared from other people who've written on this subject, as well as my own experience around working with this. So thank you all so much. Let's do just a short little dedication. Oh, another comment from Whitney, please. Yes.
Where can we find the recording of yesterday's lecture?
That will also be out, Vanessa.
I will post it today.
Okay, great. So that'll be at the Gonpo Ludups. You can go through the website, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good. So let's just do a dedication. And through the dedication, that is, again, a way of sort of sealing all this positive energy. We've had good intentions coming together these 3 days, engaging in these sessions. We want to make sure that everything that we've done is not wasted in the least, but brings forth the greatest possible benefit for ourselves and all beings. So we hold that thought that through what we've done here, may it help each of us to achieve our own potential of Buddhahood as quickly as possible, so we then can help others to do the same. We also want to dedicate for all the amazing teachers that we do have in our lives. And you can think about your own individual spiritual guides, teachers, those who have helped you on your path. But we can also think about His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who is guiding so many people in this world. And also Lama Zopa Rinpoche, the spiritual director for the FPMT. And again, any other teachers we have, may they all have good health, long lives. May we and others never be parted from perfect spiritual guides in all our lifetimes. And I also like to end all of our dedications with dedicating for those beings we're holding in our hearts. And again, some of you have expressed your own experience with those that you've lost. Their continuum is still there. Their minds are together with another existence, but we can hold them in our thoughts and dedications. We can also hold anyone we know of who's experiencing pain, suffering, illness, who's has obstacles in their life right now. Perhaps even we know those who are dying right now or who have died recently. Whoever it is that we're thinking about, we send this positive energy out to them, kind of in the spirit of Tonglen. Kind of want to give it all away. Don't hold any of it back. Think it goes out and becomes exactly what they need to be free from their suffering and to find true peace and happiness. This is the real kind of bodhisattva spirit, is to want others to benefit from everything that we do. So may this happen for all those that we're holding in our hearts right now. And may this also happen for all beings through what we've done here this weekend. Wonderful. Thank you all. I appreciate everyone being here a little bit longer than the allotted time. And I look forward to being back with you again.